I recall Olivia sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling on her phone, the very moment she decided to ruin our marriage. I had just arrived home from work, ready to drop off my luggage, and there she was, scrolling through her phone as if she didn't have a care in the world. Then, without even looking up, she casually stated, "Marcus, I want a divorce." No preamble, no explanation. Just those 4 words. I froze, trying to process what I'd just heard. At first, I thought I must have misunderstood her. Despite the fury starting to bubble up inside me, I stayed calm and asked, "Excuse me?" But she didn't hesitate. She repeated, "I want a divorce," her tone implying that I was too slow to catch on the first time. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it, as if she were commenting on the weather. Her blatant insolence stunned me. What struck me most in that moment wasn't the shock. It was the weight of everything we'd been through together. And yet, with her arms crossed, Olivia simply said, "This isn't the life I signed up for. I need someone who works and contributes." I almost laughed. I wanted to. But instead, I kept my cool. After years of building my career from scratch, earning a 6-figure salary and preparing us for a future most people couldn't even dream of, I simply stood there in silence. Olivia had never once asked about my job. She'd shown no interest in how I made my money, and yet she assumed I was just barely scraping by. I leaned on the counter and watched her, exuding the confidence of someone utterly convinced she was making the right choice. Finally, I put my bag down and said, "If you want a divorce, Olivia, I won't stop you." For a brief second, I saw hesitation flicker across her face. But then, just as quickly, it was replaced with that same arrogant smile. She said, "I've already spoken to a lawyer." Her audacity almost made me laugh, but I didn't fight her. "Fair enough," I said, heading upstairs. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting for an outburst, for me to plead, to argue, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. I sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet of our bedroom and let the situation sink in. This wasn't about divorce. It was about Olivia needing to feel in control. She wanted to paint me as the failure in our relationship, as if that would justify her actions. But I wasn't going to play her game. In the days that followed, her behavior became a textbook example of passive aggression. She nitpicked everything, from how I folded laundry to how I made my coffee. She mocked my hobbies, my routines, even my way of spending evenings. It was as if she was trying to convince herself and everyone else that leaving me was the only logical choice. And then, there was Brian. At first, I didn't think much about the way she kept mentioning his name. Brian said this, or Brian suggested that. He was, after all, a friend to both of us. But over time, it became impossible to ignore. She spoke of him with a warmth that twisted my stomach, and the pieces began to fall into place. Olivia started dressing up more for her lunches with Brian, and she always had some excuse to explain away her behavior. "We're just friends," she'd say, or "You're overanalyzing things," but I didn't confront her. What would have been the point? She would have lied, twisted the narrative, and made me out to be paranoid. So I let her think I was blind. The breaking point came one day when I was packing some essentials into a suitcase. Olivia leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed, a smug look on her face. "Have you figured out where you're going yet?" she asked. I zipped up my bag and replied, "Don't worry about me, Olivia. I'll be fine." She sighed, irritated by my composure. "Good," she said, "because Brian and I are throwing a dinner party here next weekend, and it'd be awkward if you were still around." Her gall was almost impressive. I simply shouldered my bag and walked past her, knowing I'd be long gone before their little party. She smirked, thinking she'd won. But Olivia had no idea that if she wanted to burn everything to the ground, I was more than ready to hand her the match. Sometimes the best revenge is silence, watching as the flames consume. everything they hold dear, and believe me, I was just getting started. Her glossy new life was slipping apart, and she sought a lifeline. She had thrown me out like yesterday's news. I didn't reply, not out of animosity, but because I didn't know her anymore. Olivia had made her decisions, and now she was living with them. My silence said 1,000 words as she and Brian rushed to stay afloat. Meanwhile, I was soaring. Possibilities were pouring in, my assets were thriving, and my life was calm and purposeful. I didn't have to face Olivia or Brian. I didn't need to yell accusations or demand an apology. My happiness and success were my revenge, and best of all, they were aware of it. They saw it in every disregarded message, every fleeting rumor about my achievements, and every confident interaction. Where I left while they scrambled to pick up the pieces, I wasn't doing it to get even. I had risen above everything. Quietly, boldly, I had finished what their choices had started. Olivia and Brian's demise wasn't an explosion, but a slow, collapsing catastrophe. From a distance, I watched it unfold, hearing tidbits from mutual friends, catching glimpses on social media. Their updates painted a clearer picture each time. At first, they seemed to be thriving. Olivia posted photos of lavish dinners and vacations, clinging to an image of a perfect life. But the cracks began to show. Dinners became less frequent, vacations disappeared, and whispers started to circulate. People noticed Olivia's once flawless hair and designer outfits were now less polished. Brian, the flashy showman, had started reusing clothes he once wore only once. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into direct updates. One day, a mutual friend called me, laughing. "Marcus, you'll love this," she said. "Olivia and Brian are having serious problems." Apparently, they were months overdue on their rent. I was stunned. Not shocked, though, because I had assumed they owned the house. Turns out they'd been renting it all along and were about to be evicted. I couldn't help but laugh. Poetic justice. Olivia had fought so hard for that house during the divorce, only to realize she couldn't afford it. Another friend told me Brian had lost his job but was pretending everything was fine. He was clearly scrambling to meet Olivia's constant demands. She, who had mocked my work ethic, now faced growing expenses and no income. One evening, as I sipped my coffee and went through my emails, I got a message. It was Olivia. "Marcus, I really need to speak with you. It's important." I stared at the message, debating whether to reply. Finally, I did. "Is everything okay?" Her response came immediately. "Brian and I are going through a tough time. I was wondering if you could loan us a little money to help us get back on our feet." I laughed out loud. The irony was too much. This was the same Olivia who had flaunted her new life with Brian, now asking for my help. My reply was brief. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm afraid I can't help. I'm sure you'll figure it out." Her next message came slower, more desperate. "Marcus, please. Just this once." I could feel the frustration in her words. I didn't bother responding. Olivia had made her bed with Brian. It was time to lie in it. A week later, Olivia and Brian were formally evicted. They'd missed the landlord's final deadline and were forced to move into a shabby apartment on the outskirts of town. A friend called me to share the news. "Marcus, you won't believe this. Their new place is a disaster." I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The consequences of their choices were speaking for themselves. Then came the final blow. One afternoon, I bumped into Olivia at the grocery store. She was pushing a cart filled with store-brand essentials. When she saw me, she froze. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling. I kept my tone neutral. "I hope you're doing well," I said, breaking the silence. She nodded quickly, muttered, "You too," and walked away. As I watched her leave, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction, yes, but also a pang of pity. Olivia was trapped in the life she had fought so hard to build, a life that had crumbled under the weight of its own lies. I didn't need to say or do anything. Life had taken care of that for me. Sometimes karma doesn't need a push. It just takes time. Everything came full circle when Olivia and Brian finally hit rock bottom. They became desperate, searching for someone to blame, someone to save them. But I wasn't that person anymore. They had underestimated me, betrayed me, and thought they could move on unscathed. In the end, they only proved one thing. The downfall of a house built on lies is inevitable.